We have had global discussions on nuclear disarmament before, but now that the Cold War, which spawned these weapons, is over, and the previous adversaries drawn into a partnership for peace, this is surely the time to agree in regimes which are global, comprehensive, verifiable, and non-discriminatory on steps to make the world a safer place. Another opportunity will arise when the non-proliferation treaty comes up for review next April. We hope that states parties will use that occasion to refashion the treaty into a real instrument for global disarmament. At Cairo last June, non-aligned ministers at India's suggestion proposed that a fourth special session on disarmament be convened. We think the time and the circumstances are right for the General Assembly to plan for special session for next year or as soon as possible. But disarmament alone will be inadequate. We are rushing towards another precipice where the disparities in wealth between nations would trigger violent revolution within states. A global convulsion will come if we continue to disregard the development imperative. The problems of development are global problems and must be addressed by all of us. We must set a substantive agenda for development, commit ourselves to it, and implement it. The World Trade Organization, which should soon come into being, must promote what we expected but did not quite achieve so far in GATT: non-discrimination, consensus, and transparency in the international trade regime. We hope that the multilateral trade negotiations will stimulate economic growth in our countries and in the world economy. It will not if the carefully negotiated consensus to which we committed ourselves at Marrakesh is destroyed by the introduction of new conditionalities. Faith in the multilateral system will be shaken if countries use their trading strength and bilateral pressure to weaken and distort agreements to which they have just become parties. The themes of the World Summit for Social Development focus on the critical issues of poverty eradication together with social integration and the need to increase avenues for productive employment, without which we will not have the broad-based, self-sustaining social and economic development that is the only guarantor of peace and security. If the summit is to succeed, we must agree upon the commitments for additional resources dedicated to national programs around the world. We should not be sidetracked from this goal by new concepts which do not command consensus and do not address the fundamental needs of development. The United Nations must also reorder its priorities so as to counter several disturbing centrifugal trends which we see emerging. What the world needs is support for the nation-state system on which the United Nations was built. In June this year, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and President Yeltsin, representing two of the largest pluralistic nations in the world, issued the Moscow Declaration on the protection of interests of pluralistic states. In this declaration, which has been circulated as a document of the General Assembly, Russia and India have put forward principles which, if acted upon, will, we think, promote greater harmony in the world. New doctrines justify armed United Nations intervention under circumstances that are not quite defined, not yet at any rate. These initiatives are well-meaning, but they do not seem to address the problems from the right end. The ultimate human right is the right to live, the right to food and shelter, without which life is impossible. The poverty of many nations makes this a problem to which there are no easy answers. If there are circumstances which justify armed multilateral intervention, by the same logic, should not United Nations have the right to enforce the equitable sharing of resources among nations? The non-aligned movement, at the meeting of its foreign ministers in Cairo this year, has suggested some guiding principles for peacekeeping operations of enduring significance. All means for the peaceful settlement of dispute chosen by the conflicting parties should be exhausted before the coercive measures are considered. Peacekeeping operation should strictly adhere to the principles of the Charter, in particular the principles of full respect for the sovereignty of states, their territorial integrity, and non-intervention in their internal affairs. Peacekeeping operations should be considered only at the request of the member states involved. The resources for peacekeeping activities should not be at the expense of resources for development activities of the United Nations. There should be no hesitation in ending those operations which have been overtaken by events or become inconsistent with their mandates. It is also important to ensure that the distinction between peacekeeping operations and other activities of the United Nations, including humanitarian assistance, is maintained at all times. The working methods of the Security Council must be reformed to enhance transparency and express the democratic aspirations of the vast majority of member states. We hope that the open-ended working group on Security Council expansion will duly reflect on these issues in its deliberations next year. All human rights are sacrosanct in India, guaranteed by a secular constitution, an independent judiciary, a free press and public opinion vigorously expressed. India's commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights has now received another institutional impetus with the establishment of our National Human Rights Commission, which has started functioning effectively with its findings published in its annual report. In keeping with our policy of transparency, we maintain a sustained dialogue with important non-governmental organizations, including the grant of greater access to them. It is true that much remains to be done on a worldwide basis to further international cooperation to promote and protect human rights. But the problem must be seen in perspective. In India, for instance, we grapple with the problems of development of 900 million people. In the Northwest and in the Northeast, we face brutal terrorist movements, often supported from abroad, which have killed thousands of innocents, made within India refugees of hundreds of thousands, threatened our sovereignty and territorial integrity. The rights of innocent and unarmed citizens must be protected. We urge that the question of human rights should not be made a politically motivated slogan insensitive to their rights. Terrorists have killed far more people in the last decades than the chemical and biological weapons which we have agreed to ban and destroy. Exactly as the international community decided that a convention was needed to outlaw those weapons, it must urgently negotiate a convention to counter and eradicate terrorism. Mr. President, the closing years of the 20th century will see the future of human society as critically poised. Will the end of Cold War mark the beginning of a new, more stable global order of freedom and well-being, growing on the basis of cooperation, consensus, and mutual respect? Or will the world instead revert to the mindset which breeds anarchy and a return to centrifugalism and destruction bit by bit, to end up once again in the tyranny of imposition and domination? Should we regress to the system of spheres of influence which led to so many wars over the last 200 years? These questions have still not been adequately answered. If the protection afforded to its weak, its most dispossessed people, is the measure of community's worth, as indeed it must be, then the millions of refugees and the conflict, poverty, hunger, and deprivation that afflict so many regions of the world today bear stark testimony to the loss of some vital ethical underpinning. If the world today is to redeem a future that seems increasingly mortgaged to greed and hatred, we must recall once again that it is the nobility of our means as well as the ends we pursue that determine our rewards. Our welfare will be determined only in accordance with the values and principles we abide by, as Mahatma Gandhi and sages before have taught and practiced. Truthfulness, charity, compassion, non-violence, and treating others as we would wish ourselves to be treated are the values that really stand the test of time. These are the values to be inculcated in our great global organization, the United Nations, to which we are all committed. Thank you, Mr. President.